So Lisa Moses, and I will be talking ethics for the next half hour. She will focus on the ethics of using owned dogs and cats as research subjects, and then I'll talk a bit about the work that ACC&D has been doing on this topic. And with that said, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Moses.
Thank you, Val. Okay. I suspect that our audience is going to fill a little bit in the next few minutes, so I think what I'm going to do is try to speed through some of this stuff so that we can get to the good stuff, but I'm afraid that we are going to run a little bit over. So I want to talk about the implications of using owned dogs and cats as research subjects, which I think has a lot of relevance for this audience in a lot of ways. I'm a veterinarian, a practicing veterinarian, and also a bioethicist. So I come at these questions from very much the point of view of the individual animal because of my clinical background. So why is this part of what we're talking about today? Well, generally the role of an ethicist is to ask questions that help illuminate potential conflicts in any kind of work and also help resolve those conflicts to reduce moral distress. So I am the self-appointed person to ask those questions today. In the development of some of the research projects that the ACC&D has been involved in, they fairly quickly realized that there was a void in ethical guidelines for the kind of work that they do, and that there was a larger void in ethical guidelines for a lot of the work that we're talking about at this conference today. So they convened this think tank in February of 2017 that lots of you participated in and that I participated in, and that was my entry into this world. So Val's going to talk more about the specifics of that, but that's how I got involved in this. So the first question I want to raise is, why do we even need ethical guidelines for this kind of work at all? Well, I think that when we are talking about things like $25 million prizes, it's pretty important to recognize that that's a really big incentive for researchers. And because of that, I think there's a clear need for transparent, fair guidelines for how the research is done and how the research is used. And I think another maybe slightly less obvious reason in this particular realm is one that I'm sure I'm not the only person here who has thought about, which is that if we are giving large amounts of money away for somebody to develop a single-use injectable permanent sterilant that works in large mammals, I think there's some pretty important social issues that we need to think about, and we have to really ensure that there are strong guidelines and hard conversations that talk about how is this technology going to be distributed and how is it going to be used. So I want to spend the next couple of slides on some information about regulations surrounding using owned dogs and cats in research, but my remarks are really and truly limited to the United States. I don't know very much about regulations outside of the United States in this arena. All I know is that places outside of here handle these things quite differently and with probably a lot more regulatory oversight than here. So I'm just talking about the US. And most of you probably know that in the United States, the Animal Welfare Act is the regulatory oversight for the use of animals. It primarily regulates the sourcing, housing, husbandry standards for animals being used in research settings and commercial businesses. But it does not supersede pet owners' property rights. So I took part in an interesting conversation at Harvard Law School in January about the future of the Animal Welfare Act. And present in the room was the acting director of APHIS, which is the US governmental agency that enforces the Animal Welfare Act. And I asked her directly, does the Animal Welfare Act protect dogs and cats who are owned? And she said to me, no, she does not believe that it does. Nominally, the letter of the law, because dogs and cats are a protected species by the Animal Welfare Act, they are technically protected, but I would argue that the way in which we protect them doesn't really serve the needs of animals outside of the laboratory setting. So I do think that there is this oversight gap. I also think that there's a pretty clear gap when we're talking about international field trials, and for those of you who maybe skipped over from the field science track earlier today, you heard more about this. ACC&D is working on this, and Val's going to talk a little bit more about this. But I also think it's no surprise to most of you in the research world that when you do research on owned dogs and cats, you can bypass a lot of the costs, a lot of the limitations, a lot of the regulations that surround the use of these animals, even though we're talking about the same species. We know this. Lots of people know this. So why am I arguing that we need different ethical standards? I think that it's pretty clear that in current human society, companion animals occupy a special moral sphere. It's not a real big stretch for me to argue that we already do give companion dogs and cats different moral standing than we do other species. And I think that my picture up here of this demonstration of the conflicted place that these animals play in our lives and society speaks to that. We know that in our world, pets are technically property. But we also know that in large-scale surveys of populations, the vast majority of people do not consider pets their property. They consider pets their family. Less than 1% of people surveyed say that they think of pets as their property. And I can tell you from the point of view of a practicing veterinarian, when clients make decisions to spend tens of thousands of dollars on medical care for their animals, they are not treating their animals like they are property. So we don't have a good way to express this kind of dichotomy of the relationship that we have. I have heard sociologists are starting to use the term kinship relationship, which covers kind of this complex version of being part of the family some of the time, property some of the time, and I think it's a nice way for us to start to think about it. So I have some concerns about using dogs and cats in research where we don't have basic ethical guidelines, and I want to tell you about some of the things that I thought about. The first is the idea of consent. We don't really get consent any more than we get consent when we enroll children in research. We get permission of the people who have control of them, and that is a different thing, and I think we need to approach it in a different way. Sometimes when I talk about this to people in the bio research world, I also talk about the idea of autonomy of the actual research subjects. The last time I brought this up, somebody who does research raised his hand and said, "Are you actually talking about the autonomy of the research subject, or are you talking about the autonomy of the researchers?" And I said, no, I actually am talking about whether or not we have to consider the autonomy of the animals that we use in research. I think the time has come for us to start to ask that question. There's an idea in bioethics that some of you may have heard of called the therapeutic misconception. And this is a very prevalent and very well-studied idea that when people are enrolled in clinical research, both they, their families, and surprisingly enough, the physicians and the researchers who are doing the research can in some way kind of confuse the idea that the goal of research is the same as the goal of clinical medicine. It's not. The goal of research is to further the aims of research. That's very different than the goal of treating a patient. And I think that given the unique relationship that we have with companion animals, that there may be a place for us to worry that the therapeutic misconception might even be a bigger factor when we're talking about having people enroll beloved animals in clinical research. And I think that it's an important concept to think about because it should inform the way that we design these trials. And then, of course, there's the very complex and convoluted role of money, particularly in veterinary medicine. And I think we've talked a little bit earlier today about some of the large industry players in veterinary medicine who are buying up clinics internationally, but who also own a lot of the other industries associated with pet care and veterinary medicine. And that makes this stuff even more complicated and more full of conflict of interest. You know, if I, as a veterinarian, am enrolling patients, my own patients, in a clinical trial that my hospital is receiving financial incentives to participate in, or what about the idea of my clients not being able to afford care for their animals unless they actually enroll their animals in a clinical trial? You know, that kind of thing would not at all be allowed to happen for human patients. But that's a regular feature of veterinary clinical trials and some of the field trials that we're talking about here today. The other things that I started to think about are, what about community animals? How do we decide who actually speaks for and works in their best interest? And what is that best interest? So I think it's really important that some basic questions about the way we define community animals and who cares for them and who actually cares about them, that should be a big factor in the way we design some of the work that we're talking about here at this conference. And what should the relationship be between the researcher and the community? Same kind of things that I was talking about in the veterinary medicine sphere, where we may have some obvious conflict of interest that need to be managed between researchers, veterinarians, and pet owners. We have a similar situation when we're talking about community animals that we have to consider. So what should we do about all these concerns that I've brought up? I think that we need to start with some minimal ethical guidelines. And these don't have to be that complicated, but we need in place some basic stuff. Some of the things that I thought about, which are very analogous to what happens with research in children, are we need to specify who's responsible when there's an adverse event, who pays for that adverse event, who provides the care when that adverse event happens. You know, those are things that we don't normally pay attention to, and they're not so great at paying attention to it in all human subject research either, but it's an obvious whole. The other thing that I have not seen come up in veterinary clinical research is the idea that the primary investigator should not be the same person who is the person enrolling the animals in the trial or the person who is providing the direct medical care. That's a pretty clear conflict of interest in human subject research, and I think it's a good idea for us to actually think about that in terms of our work. The other thing that is a little interesting about using owned animals in contrast to animals in the laboratory setting is we don't always, ahead of time, determine a humane endpoint. And, you know, some people would argue in the kind of clinical work that I do, for example, where I work primarily on chronic pain and palliative care, you know, I think in some cases, some of the patients that I see are less protected than dogs and cats in research arenas where somebody has had to set a humane endpoint. And I think we need to think about that too. So one way that you could think about doing this is you could take a tip from how we do research on kids and also other specific populations of people that are termed vulnerable populations. We might be talking about people who are disenfranchised for some other reason, either economically, socially. Kids is probably the one that is most analogous to our situation. But there's a whole bunch of criteria that are associated with this idea of doing research on vulnerable populations that is very applicable to what we do on animals. I also thought about the idea of a hybrid IACUC institutional review board to try to address some of these gaps that exist for doing research on animals outside of the laboratory setting. And there are a couple of examples of these. A few academic centers of veterinary medicine, University of Pennsylvania, for example, has developed a special panel that reviews protocols that enroll owned pets as opposed to laboratory housed animals. The pharmaceutical industry is starting to create some of these panels, but again, just like every other IACUC, these are self-determined, self-policed things. There's no universal guidelines for these. And what it comes down to is who's a member of the committee and what is their actual background and philosophical bent in these things. Okay, I want to turn it over to Val and let her talk about some of the ACC&D's efforts in this realm. So thank you.
Thank you so much. With that excellent foundation, I'm going to briefly discuss ACC&D's experiences and then turn to the projects that we have initiated in response over the past year. So in various sessions, speakers have discussed two studies that ACC&D undertook in the past couple years, each of which have posed a variety of ethical dilemmas. Our first study, as Dr. Fisher has spoken about, and Dr. Mackey has spoken about, was to advance an injectable contraceptive in free-roaming cats. The vaccine Gonacon was already successfully tested in laboratory cats in terms of safety and efficacy, and so the next step was to test it in our ultimate target population of free-roaming cats. Some of the ethical questions that arose in that process were, where should we get the cats? What kind of consent was appropriate? Was it appropriate for cats at high risk of euthanasia in an animal shelter to participate? And really, should shelter cats ever participate in research? Excuse me. And for the second study, as spoke about today and yesterday, we sought to trial an ear marker in a real-world dog population. We knew that it had shown promise in sheltered dogs who received the tag under anesthesia, as well as in indoor-outdoor pet cats anesthetized for dental work. Wanting to trial in a population that had the potential to personally benefit from an ear marker, we scoured the literature for guidelines in making ethically responsible decisions in these field conditions, and what we found was a major gap. The lack of universal guidance available for a subsection of research and interventions combined with our own experience led ACC&D to hold a think tank in 2017, as Dr. Moses introduced. The focus was ethical decision-making in innovation for animal welfare, and a small cohort of our many fabulous participants are listed on this slide. One focus of the think tank was veterinary trials and novel interventions, especially studies or projects that don't fall within traditional contexts or that aren't required to undergo institutional ethical review. The recommendation was to create a guidance document to outline a framework of considerations, guidance, and case studies for ethical decision-making. It starts with the idea that in designing a study, there must be certain criteria for the well-being of animals and humans, not all of which are captured in current ethical review structures. And of course, many organizations, including NGOs, do not need to go through any ethical review process at all. The ultimate vision was that the customized guidelines could be created pulling the best information and processes from the spheres you see here and then brought to life through an easy-to-access online tool. The nascent project received funding from the William and Charlotte Parks Foundation late last summer. And I'll now turn to sharing some completed work and some work in progress that I'm excited about. But before I do that, I want to note that Dr. Lou Tasker, who's an animal welfare consultant from the UK, has been the lead designer for this work and deserves tremendous credit for where it is today. And also I want to acknowledge that many from the think tank also remain involved to craft the final products. So who is the intended audience for these new resources? They're intended to be helpful for scientists, veterinarians, animal welfare professionals, and staff involved in quote-unquote field research to help dogs and cats. We define field as outside a laboratory, so it can range from clinical studies in a local veterinary office to projects in a local neighborhood to projects in another country. And interventions can be as common as trap, neuter, vaccinate, return, animal birth control programs, or as novel as research and testing of non-surgical fertility control technologies. So I'll walk through the work in progress for the resource. In this slide here is a roadmap for what we call our guidance document and the toolkits that are its companion piece. The guidance document will introduce all the concepts that are below in the toolkit list in online or PDF form. And then you'll be able to click through online to the toolkits of interest. In the toolkits of interest, you'll find more in-depth discussion, practical examples, and case studies of applying those concepts in the field. The toolkits are divided into 3 clusters. The first focuses on ethical principles and review. The second is what we call cross-cutting themes or core issues that stretch across stakeholders, including understanding and addressing conflicts of interest, obtaining consent, and adequate monitoring. And finally, we have toolkits on key stakeholders, including animals themselves, owners or caregivers, and the broader community. The next slide shows mock-ups of the guidance document currently under review. And at this point, I also want to give a special thanks to IFA and their e-learning consultant, Nancy Barr, who has worked with us to visualize these materials. This slide here shows the cover of what is currently about the 35-page guidance document. The tabs you see on the right are the toolkit entry ports that you saw also on the roadmap. And the clickable table of contents here will let people skip to review or re-review sections of most relevance or interest to them. The structure of the guidance also divides into what to do when planning interventions, as well as notes about course correction mid-project, which is quite important. And this slide is just a glimpse into the toolkit about key stakeholders. Getting the content set, we are now eager to convert some things you see here in the text to be more interactive. In this toolkit, there are, for now, 3 case studies, and for each, examples that are worked through to define stakeholders and the benefits and risks and harm to each of those parties. This grid here is an example of what can be done as a fillable online tool or completed as a participatory exercise. And in this slide, case studies describe what measures a group took as a result of conducting the stakeholder assessment. This particular page here shows a grid that is worked through for each stakeholder. One case study that we have now is around cat TNR, another is a clinical trial in a veterinary practice, and a third is a community-based dog population management project. So I'm hoping that this might work. Here is the website. There will be an option to start a course and have access to all the guidance document and the toolkits, as well as a scroll bar to a bunch of subtopics. In this case, framework, why do an ethical review, what is ethics, animal ethics, and a review page of core concepts. So again, we are still quite early in the process of developing this, but it will continue to flesh out in the weeks and months ahead. At this point, I love to open up for questions, comments. We would love your feedback on this, how it might be useful to you in your work. Case studies are always welcome, in fact, needed. And so we'd love to talk to you further if you would like to contribute in any way or let us know what would be useful to you. Thank you.
Joyce Briggs, ACC&D. This may have been your last slide, and I have it in case you would like to reference it. Do you want to talk a little bit about our role here and next steps and aspirations? Or if you'd like me to, I have the slide.
Sure, go for it. Go for
Okay.
it.
So what we are really, as this was very pertinent to our work, and yet we are very much a niche organization. We discovered this had a much broader need and broader appeal to organizations that are doing field work. Our intent is to kind of incubate this project as we have some other, and to work with other organizations that may originally fondly rehome this project to a broader missioned organization. We want to get it up and running in beta testing, and again, I want to credit IFAW, who is going to beta test and look at how it could work for looking at their processes for review. We are eager for others that might be interested in beta testing and helping us refine the content. That's probably the key point of that. But I would say that even the process of going through this has really helped with us reaching some sort of resolution about some of the ethical challenges we went through. So that's been helpful to us, and we are eager to better develop this tool for our future work and for others that are finding a similar need.